things you must get right. First, you must identify and implement an approach that will work for you. Ideally, that approach will be based upon empirical research and the experience of others. Most importantly, that approach must fit well with your personal goals, constraints, time horizon, and risk tolerance. Once you've identified your approach, the second thing you must do is ignore all the insanity going on around you and stick to that approach. You must also continue to evaluate what you're doing and tweak it as necessary. Notice that I use the word tweak as opposed to abandon. By the way, the dictionary definition of tweak is improve a mechanism or system by making fine adjustments to it. This is an important distinction because, once you've identified your approach to your finances, one of the biggest risks you face is abandoning that approach. Of course, this presupposes that the process you plan to use is a sound and logical one. The good news is that history provides clues about the best way to find just such a process. So rather than fumbling through the darkness like some ancient explorer in search of El Dorado, you can instead learn from and assimilate the lessons of the past, and let those lessons guide you to the Golden City. Therefore, the first goal of this book is to teach you an approach that will give you a high probability of attaining financial freedom. Importantly, this approach will be free from hyperbole or speculation and will be based on sound financial research. If you consistently follow the approach laid out in this book, and you do so over a sufficiently long period of time, you are virtually certain to attain a degree of financial success greater than the majority of the general population. Of course, you'll need to keep in mind that financial success is a relative term, and expectations should be realistic. What may be attainable for someone earning $1 million a year may be unattainable for someone making $50,000. The goal is to attain a significant level of financial success relative to your means. For many folks, this means they are able to live a lifestyle in retirement comparable to that which they enjoyed while working. Always remember that with the power of compound interest, which Albert Einstein reputedly described as the most powerful force in the universe, time is the ally of the patient investor. Ultimately, identifying and implementing a process designed to produce financial success really isn't that difficult. Even relatively novice listeners of this book should, upon its conclusion, be able to design and build a system that will allow them to embark upon the course to financial freedom. And that, dear listener, brings us to the second goal of this book, and that is where the trouble often begins. Staying the course and sticking with the approach you've identified can be incredibly difficult, especially in a world of information overload and political, economic, and financial turmoil. On the surface, this shouldn't be the case. After all, the approach you're implementing is based on sound, fundamental research, has logic on its side, and has worked for millions of people just like you. But wait, I hear you saying, weren't things different way back when? So maybe this approach worked 10, 20, 30, or 40 years ago, but things are different now. And you're right. Things are different these days, and those who suggest otherwise are either deceiving you or themselves. For example, we now have the threat of war in the Middle East, or with North Korea, or maybe even someday with China. And this certainly is different, because in the 1960s we had war with Vietnam, and in the 1940s war with Germany and Japan. And yet this approach worked during those time frames. But now we have the risk of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists, and surely this makes things different. And you're right, it does. Because for most of the 20th century, we were worried about Russia's WMDs rather than terrorists' WMDs. And yet this approach worked during those time frames. Surely, though, the political uncertainty we face is unprecedented, and we need to change our approach because of that. I mean, presidents even get impeached these days. And you're right, the political uncertainty we face is different than that which we faced in the past. For instance, I'm virtually certain Richard Nixon will not resign the presidency in the next several years, nor do I think that adults of any gender, race, or creed will have to once again fight for the right to vote, as they did for so much of the 20th century. And yet this approach worked during those time frames. But who knows what will happen with the economy? Maybe inflation will accelerate. It might. Yet I tend to think we are unlikely to see the double-digit inflation that we saw in the 1970s. And yet, even if 1970s hyperinflation comes to pass, remember that this approach worked during that time period. These days, markets are more volatile and prices swing much more quickly, so maybe this approach worked during times of relative